It started with a phone call that should have been routine, the kind that barely raises an eyebrow, the kind police officers handle every day without thinking twice. A neighbor reported something strange, a house that had been completely silent for days. No lights, no movement, no response. Nothing about the call suggested what was waiting inside. And yet, what investigators would soon uncover would become one of the most shocking murders they would ever face. A case so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend how it was possible. When officers arrived at the house, everything looked perfectly normal. The lawn was trimmed. The windows were intact. The front door was locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damaged locks. From the outside, the home looked peaceful, untouched, frozen in time. But silence has a way of hiding the worst truths. And as soon as the door was opened, that illusion began to crumble. The air inside felt wrong. Not just stale, but heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Every room appeared neat. Furniture was in place. Nothing was overturned. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious clues, no blood visible at first glance. It was the kind of scene that made no sense because in cases like this, chaos usually speaks loudly. Here, chaos was silent. As officers moved deeper into the house, they discovered the victim in a back bedroom. The body was positioned in a way that immediately raised questions. There were injuries, but they didn't match any obvious weapon found nearby. No knife, no firearm, no blunt object within reach. The victim hadn't been restrained. There were no defensive wounds that would normally suggest a violent confrontation. It was as if the victim had been caught completely off guard, or worse, had trusted whoever was responsible. Investigators quickly realized this was not a random act. There was no theft. Valuable items were untouched. Electronics were still plugged in. Cash was still inside drawers. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was something far more deliberate. Someone had come into this house for one reason only, and once that reason was fulfilled, they had left without leaving behind the kind of mess murder usually creates. The timeline became the first major challenge. The medical examiner estimated the victim had been dead for several days. During that time, no one had heard anything. No screams, no disturbance. The house had simply gone quiet. That silence was now screaming questions investigators couldn't answer. Neighbors were interviewed, but their statements only deepened the mystery. No unfamiliar cars, no arguments, no late-night activity. The victim was described as private, routine-oriented, not someone who attracted trouble. There were no known enemies, no recent conflicts, no history of violence. On paper, there was no clear reason for this person to be murdered. Inside the house, forensic teams worked meticulously. Fingerprints were collected. Surfaces were tested. Floors were examined inch by inch. What they found was unsettling. There were signs that someone had been inside for an extended period, yet they had managed to leave almost nothing behind. It was as if the killer knew exactly how to move without being noticed, exactly how to erase their presence. One detail stood out. A small, easily overlooked disturbance near the bedroom doorway. Not damage, not a mess, but something that suggested repeated movement in and out of the room. It was subtle, but to trained eyes, it mattered. This wasn't a quick attack. This wasn't impulsive. Whatever happened here unfolded over time. As investigators dug into the victim's life, they found nothing that pointed to danger. No threatening messages, no strange calls, no unusual behavior leading up to the death. Friends and co-workers described the victim as cautious, predictable, and careful, which raised a terrifying possibility. If the victim was careful, then whoever did this wasn't a stranger. The autopsy results added another layer of horror. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. There were no dramatic wounds, no single fatal blow. Instead, the injuries suggested a methodical process, one that required patience and control. This wasn't rage. This wasn't panic. This was calculated. Detectives began to realize they were dealing with someone who planned this carefully. Someone who understood timing, behavior, and vulnerability. Someone who waited for the perfect moment. The house itself may have been locked, but that didn't mean the killer broke in. It meant they were let in, or they never left. As night fell and the house was
correct?
sealed off, one question
Yes,
echoed among the
that's right.
investigators. How does someone get murdered inside a locked home, without noise, without witnesses, without evidence, and without anyone realizing until days later? The answer, they suspected, was far more unsettling than a simple break-in, and the deeper they looked, the more it became clear that the most terrifying part of this case wasn't how the victim died, it was how close the killer may have been, hiding in plain sight, long before anyone realized a crime had even been committed. As the investigation continued, detectives shifted their focus away from the crime scene and toward the patterns surrounding the victim's final days. Phone records were analyzed. Security footage from nearby streets was reviewed frame by frame. Bank transactions were examined. What emerged wasn't a sudden disruption, but a slow, almost invisible deviation from routine. In the days leading up to the murder, the victim had interacted with someone regularly, not a stranger, not a random encounter, someone familiar enough to avoid suspicion, familiar enough to move freely, familiar enough to remain unnoticed. This realization changed everything. The killer didn't need to force entry. They already belonged there. Investigators reconstructed the timeline carefully. They determined that the victim had likely been alive for hours after the last known contact with the outside world. During that time, the house remained quiet. No emergency calls, no cries for help. That silence suggested control, not chaos, not panic, but dominance. The method of the crime now made chilling sense. The killer didn't rely on sudden violence. They relied on patience, on trust, on the absence of resistance. This was not a crime driven by emotion. It was driven by intent. Every step seemed designed to minimize noise, minimize evidence, and delay discovery for as long as possible. When detectives finally identified their primary suspect, the reaction was disbelief. This was someone who had been near the victim regularly, someone who knew their habits, someone who had been inside the house before without raising concern. On the surface, there was nothing that screamed danger, but beneath that surface was a carefully hidden reality. Interviews revealed inconsistencies, small contradictions, details that didn't align. The suspect remembered events that didn't happen and forgot moments that should have been unforgettable. These weren't dramatic lies. They were subtle fractures in a story that had been rehearsed too well. Forensic evidence began to connect. The dots, trace materials, nearly invisible, placed the suspect inside the room at the time of death. Not enough to be obvious, but enough when combined with the timeline and behavior. Piece by piece, the illusion of innocence collapsed. When confronted, the suspect didn't react with shock or denial. Instead, there was a calmness that disturbed even the most experienced investigators. It was the calm of someone who believed they had already won, someone who thought they had planned for every possibility. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it is buried. Under pressure, details slipped. Motives emerged. Control, resentment, and a desire to dominate without detection became clear. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of patience. The final revelation shook everyone involved. The killer hadn't just entered the house to commit the murder. They had been there long before, watching, waiting, studying. The victim never realized they were in danger, because the threat didn't look like a threat. It looked like familiarity. When the case finally went to court, the locked door mystery was no longer the focus. The real horror wasn't how the killer got in. It was how easily trust had been weaponized, how silence had been used as a shield, how a controlled, methodical approach had allowed someone to take a life without leaving chaos behind. This case would later be studied by investigators as a lesson in perception, a reminder that danger doesn't always break doors or shatter windows. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits down and waits for the right moment. The house was eventually cleaned. The evidence was catalogued. The case was closed. But the questions it raised never truly disappeared. How many crimes go unnoticed because they don't look like crimes? How often does familiarity blind us to risk? The most shocking part of this murder wasn't the violence itself. It was the simplicity, the patience, the way it unfolded without warning, without sound, and without immediate consequence. A life ended, not with chaos, but with silence. And that silence is what makes this case so terrifying, because it reminds us that some of the most real horrors don't announce themselves. They don't break in, they don't rush, they wait.